Assassin's Promise by Thomas Woodward. Chapter 36. Millie wondered in surprise what the sounds were. She heard the trills of a horn, wasn't it? But why out here? Were there other travelers that were trying to get their attention? Both Gerald and Kayana had left the seating area and were clambering outside the wagon. She had felt a sharp increase in speed. Whoever it was, Jess was either racing them or running from them, but why? Could it be bandits like Kayana had hinted at? She felt her stomach twist at the thought. A sensation of sharp needles prickled the skin of her neck as she considered the possibility. Maybe she could hide. But then she would starve or die of thirst out in the middle of the desert if she left the wagon. She would have to trust her protectors to guard her, as they'd been hired to do. She felt thick worry constrict her thoughts. She didn't want to be alone, not now. Tugging off her fastening belt, she moved forwards towards one of the doors and unlatched it. Since they were moving much more quickly, it would be dangerous footing, and tripping now could be deadly. She could see the earth in a blur as she looked down before stepping out of the wagon. This time she heard it unmistakably. It was the sounding of a horn. It was not far off, behind them. Millie did not have the courage to look behind them. She desperately wanted to catch up to Kayana. The woman would protect her. She had promised. Brushing tangled red locks out of her face, Millie climbed towards the front of the wagon, the air rushing past her furiously. She reached out, one handhold after another, careful not to lose her balance, lest she tumble to the fast-moving ground beneath them. Millie, I will need you to be brave. Can you do that? Kayana's face was kind, but serious at the same time. The other woman looked alert, wary. Millie was quick to nod her head in agreement. Yes, she said, without being sure if she could. The cold knot in her middle had widened out into her limbs. Millie felt queasy and very unsure of herself just then. Kayana was not afraid. She could feel the other woman's strength of presence just by standing near her. Kayana moved towards the rear of the wagon caravan, leaving Millie with her roiling emotions. She still couldn't bring herself to look behind her. Some part of her wasn't ready to face what was really happening, even now. Numbly, Millie continued moving forwards towards the front of the wagon, where Jess and Gerald would be maintaining control of the horses. At the speed they were going, she was amazed they hadn't tired already. Surely the poor animals couldn't keep up this ground-eating pace for very long. Gerald saw her and nodded to her grimly. Millie didn't think he meant to, but maybe he had trouble reining in his own emotions given their current situation. Part of her mind kept telling herself, "Don't worry, it's probably just a misunderstanding. Jess is going to tell us he was playing a joke on us all along. Don't be afraid." Millie almost tripped and caught a glance behind her. She saw a group of riders on horses pulling forward together in a group, intent. Another horn blast sounded. Some of the riders began unshackling weapons and holding them loose at their sides as the horses raced forwards. A long metal rod was held in one of the men's hands. It had a long, heavy chain attached with which ended in a solid steel ball that jostled as his horse galloped forward. Bandits. The shock and fear finally hit her. No, this could not be. Her parents had hired guards. They had promised to keep her safe. Gerald picked her up and quickly lifted her into the wagon seat between him and Jess. He didn't say a word, but she could feel him tensing his muscles sitting next to him. He was scared too. He must be. How could this have happened? She didn't want to die. Maybe they could plead for their lives. They would be let go, wouldn't they? Only the empty wind responded. She would not die now, not here. She had to think. Something. An arrow passed overhead. It flew about a span above Jess's head and flew past the horses to skitter off the rock canyon walls to their left. Another bolt was loosed. She could clearly see the black and white fletchings as it sped overhead. Terror began to well up in her. She heard Gerald pull out his heavy cudgel. She could feel the weight of it by how much he tensed just then, sitting next to her. Ducking his head low, he climbed towards the back of the wagon, completely focused on this task in front of him. Millie huddled near Jess. The old man's breath came quick, but he bent down to her just then. "Oh, child, stay close, stay close." He began to mumble incoherently. Millie felt tears sting her eyes. Her mind was giving in to the terror. She just had to stay upright. She had to, or her mother would be ashamed of her. Her mother, Marie, and father, she could see their smiling faces now in front of her. They were ghost-like images. They were ghost-like images that her terrified mind had created desperately. Millie huddled in on herself. Her mother loved her. Why was she here? Why now? If only we had left when I was old enough. The wagon crashed and jerked, tearing her free from her thoughts. They still careened forward at a deadly speed, but she could hear the shouts of men behind her. Another jolt shot through the wagon, almost causing them to tip. Jess fought for control, but one of the horses broke loose just then and galloped off in a different direction, eyes white with fear. The other horses were lathered with sweat from keeping up this killing pace. The wagon almost tipped before jerking forward again, another loud crash sounding at the back of it. Millie looked behind her and had an unobstructed view. What she saw took her breath from her. Men were latching hold of the back of the wagon and jumping up from their horses up onto its back. Kayana spun with her heavy blade. She seemed to move as if she were dancing on water. Millie recognized one of the stretching poses she had seen the woman perform earlier. Inan Ka, Kayana had called that one. The move involved spreading her legs in a wide stance and raising her torso up towards the sun. She had never seen it adapted with the use of a weapon. Kayana flowed upwards, her blade flashing like bronze fire as she parried a blow, then riposted cleanly into the neck of another man. The heavy-set man fell backwards off the wagon, spurting blood from a wide gash in his throat. Immediately, other riders started pulling themselves up alongside the caravan and hauling themselves off their horses onto the back of it. A set of riders on each side moved forwards on horseback to try and secure the driver's area. Millie was frozen with fear as she locked eyes with a rider, a cold-faced woman showing little emotion. Another rider behind the first split his face into a wide grin at her as he galloped towards the front. Paralyzed, Millie just sat there as the riders edged closer. Kayana continued to move in a blur, neatly knocking one man off the back of the wagon onto the ground before dodging the swing of another rider's crude blade. Risking leaving her back to those who were gaining purchase on the back of the wagon, Kayana sped towards Millie before being pulled down from behind by two men. A quick axe blade fell, but Millie was unable to see if the blow had landed true. Immediately from her right, Gerald raced forward, meeting the two riders that were heading up towards Jess. A heavy cudgel blow knocked the grinning man off his horse, but Gerald took a slash in the chest from the female rider in return. Grunting in pain, Gerald fell backwards, hand gripping his chest, awash with blood. Standing unsteadily, Gerald tried to follow the woman, but fell back to his knees, cursing. "I have to do something," Millie thought frantically. The world seemed to be moving in slow motion. She knew if the rider reached Jess, they would lose control of the horses and could be overtaken. She saw Kayana being held in place from behind, still thrashing to gain purchase on her opponents. They were toying with her. "I am the only one who can do something," she realized suddenly. She felt icy fear, like an overwhelming blanket, encompass her completely. Still, she managed to move forward, her only goal to intercept the female rider. She had no plan for what she would do after reaching her. She screamed a primal, piercing howl. It was all she could think of. The rider looked over, startled. Millie wasted no time and raced forward towards Jess. The aged driver was fighting for control of the remaining horses that had not broken loose. They were still barreling through the canyon, the footing rocky and treacherous. Millie had only bought scarcely a second or two from the rider's momentary confusion. She had almost made it to Jess. Jess was currently trying to fend off another rider from the other side of the wagon with a heavy stick, but he was sorely outmatched. He had to keep one hand on the reins, and the other man had sharp steel. It was just a matter of time. The female rider leaped off her horse onto the side of the driver's cart. Millie intercepted her and did the only thing she could think of. She stomped on the fingers of the other woman with as much force as possible. The other woman was still in the act of pulling herself up when Millie's heel crunched down on one of her hands. Swearing in pain, the hard woman swayed backwards, but still maintained her balance with the other arm. She was precipitously balanced, standing on the back of her horse. An idea came to Millie suddenly. If she could spook the horse that was racing forwards, the woman would lose balance and fall from the wagon. She had to act now. Thinking quickly, she screamed again at the top of her lungs, then tore one of the heavy red river stone earrings from her ear and threw it directly at the horse's face. Bloody, it bounced off the horse's muzzle, but had the desired effect, causing the horse to spook. The beginning of a shout was lost as the hard-faced woman was immediately pulled under the moving wagon. The sickening sound of her body being crushed under the weight of the wagon followed shortly thereafter. Adrenaline rushed through Millie, her feet unsteady as the wagon bucked forwards wildly. The rider on the other end of the wagon was still trying to gain purchase, but Jess was vigilant and had managed to keep them from climbing up. He had lost control of the reins in order to block the sword swings of the other man. The wooden stick he held had been cut deeply in several places. She wondered if any of the attacks had gotten through his defenses. The horses were riding forward through a narrow pass that was coming up in the canyon. The path ahead funneled still farther in the distance, narrowing to barely the width of a wagon cart. She dove for the reins, hoping Jess could protect her from the flashing sword of the rider. She had seen her father hold the reins of a horse cart many times, but he had only allowed her to hold them under very close supervision only once or twice. She hoped she wouldn't bungle it too badly. It tore at her to leave Kayana to her fate, but she didn't know how she could possibly help the woman. Jess grunted to her left, blocking another sword thrust only barely. The old man was surprisingly agile, Millie thought detachedly. "Keep them together, young miss. Our lives depend on it," Jess shouted before turning back to the rider. The other man was deadly silent, intensely focused on unseating the driver. Terror welled into Millie, seeing the rider's cold, expressionless face. She knew she looked into the face of a seasoned killer. Millie turned back to the task at hand and pulled a tight hand on the reins, the horses moving to obey, just short of running headlong into a rocky outcropping. Their eyes were white with fear, and their coats steamed with sweat as they continued their mad gallop forward through the canyon.